All right, so I'm Laura, and today I'll be discussing Gottlieb Chapter 4, Assessment of Oral Language and Literacy Development. So far, we've learned about academic language and how it links language and content. And we've also learned that assessment should match the instructional practice. So the tasks that you use in your classroom should be the tasks that you use for constructing the items on the test. And the assessment should also reflect the student characteristics, so they should not be biased, and they should not include linguistic and sociocultural information that the students would not be aware of. Also, assessment should provide useful information, and this information should guide your future instruction, and it should also let you know what your students know. So Gottlieb Chapter 4 talks about how to assess language across various domains, and these 4 domains are speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And then it talks about applying language learning and assessment to multiliteracies. So multiliteracies use various texts such as written texts, videos, and images. And it says that performance tests should be tied to the key uses of academic language. And these are based on the WIDA standards, and they include recounting, arguing, discussing, and explaining. And lastly, it talks about cross-linguistic transfer, or the interaction between languages, and how the various languages that a student has are linguistic resources. So initially, the text talks about cognitively challenging tasks, and these increase engagement, which increase achievement, and in doing so, they can decrease equity gaps. So by sparking enthusiasm, we can measure our students' true performance, because they'll want to be engaged, and then hopefully they'll have higher achievement. So the book talks about academic talk and academic conversations in the classroom. So academic language is central to all content areas, and literacy and learning are built upon academic conversations in the classroom. However, the book mentions how academic talk is often absent in classrooms with large numbers of ELLs. So we should find ways to improve that. And some ways that we can do that are by using our resources. So we should tap into the home language. And again, this is going into the cross-linguistic transfer, which we'll talk about later. And then we should also use resources such as paraprofessionals and online resources. And the resources that are used in instruction should be applied to assessment. So the book talks about when assessing language domains, sometimes it's necessary to isolate them. This is kind of difficult because, as we've learned previously, there's always an elicitation mode and a response mode, so it's hard to isolate them completely. The book also says how listening comprehension is generally the first to be acquired. Although for me personally, sometimes I think with Spanish, the reading is easier. But generally, receptive language is greater than expressive language, which I guess kind of goes in with what I've noticed with myself, with the reading being better than the writing and speaking. So listening comprehension, well, it's vital for achieving verbal expression and communicative competence. So we definitely need our students to be good at listening comprehension. And it requires an interaction between their knowledge of the topic, of how the information is organized, and an interpretation of cultural inferences. And before we do a listening comprehension test, the students need to know the purpose. So they need to know what specific information they should be looking for, and then the amount of detail. And I think one way to do this is if you have comprehension questions, you can give them to the students, on a piece of paper before the listening task, so they can read through and have the questions in their mind to know what they should be looking for. Also, students will be using their prior contextual and linguistic knowledge. So before we do a task like this, we should try to activate their prior knowledge or do some examples to activate that linguistic knowledge. So not being acclimated to the linguistic system can affect the listening comprehension. And then unfamiliarity with socio-cultural context can affect it as well. If they're unfamiliar with certain situations, or maybe the use of sarcasm, that might affect their comprehension. Different background and topical knowledge can affect them. So again, it's important that we know about their background knowledge. And unique expressions such as idioms, like it's raining cats and dogs, that can affect their listening comprehension negatively if they're not familiar with these unique expressions. And also their home language can have an effect. So, so why do we assess listening? We assess it to investigate specific linguistic aspects. You can do discrete point testing, where you're looking at a specific linguistic aspect. And you can also do phonemic discrimination. For example, you could say the word sheep out loud, and then you would have the pictures of the sheep in the ship, or the words written out, and the student has to circle what word they heard. So that'd be an example of discriminating between minimal pairs. You could also do that with word families or cognates. However, when you're investigating these specific linguistic aspects, it's very inauthentic and decontextualized. It's not authentic to say a word and say, hey, what word did I say? Did I say sheep or ship? That just doesn't happen in real life. So we should also assess for communicative purposes, focusing on the intent of the message and how the language is used. So when we're doing this, we should use authentic text and portray realistic situations and natural interactions. So you could have like a real conversation, for example, and have the students listen to that. And these have the greatest applicability and utility to classrooms with ELLs, because it's going to be more useful for them if they're practicing understanding authentic conversations versus just hearing and discriminating minimal pairs, although that might have some benefit if they have trouble with pronunciation and stuff. All right, so we should instruct at the I+1 level. The I level is what the student can do on their own. And so the I+1 level is what they can do with our help, with our the scaffolding of the teacher. So we should assess at the level that students can demonstrate non-verbally, and we can provide oral input, such as with videos or with interactions. And the students can demonstrate their comprehension by pointing to images. This is maybe for students at a lower level who have not yet mastered, or not mastered, but have not yet reached a high level of production. We could also provide an oral word bank, saying words out loud, and then they put them in a Venn diagram, for example. Students can also demonstrate comprehension by using their home language, which we'll talk about later. This is an example of translanguaging. And they can demonstrate comprehension by doing performance tasks. So if they can follow directions, that shows they're listening, for example. All right, so here's some ideas of how they can demonstrate their listening comprehension. They could construct a model or reenact a scene from a narrative text that was read out loud, and they could design a chart and do all those other things. All right, so when we're recording student progress, which I think we read about in Lon Ecke's chapter 6, we can use anecdotes, and these should be specific but concise, and we should mention the context in which they occurred. And we can use checklists, and we can borrow these from online and then modify them and add comments, and we can have tallies and use standards reference rating scales, which can help us record the student's level. And we can also use rubrics. And again, these are great for recording the student's progress over time. So when we're assessing speaking, we should use activities that require both partners to talk, and we should insist on critical and creative thinking. So we don't want them to just be a simple answer, a yes or a no, because that doesn't really push them further with their production. And we should take on controversial issues and encourage them to take on varying perspectives or positions, because again, this kind of goes under the key uses of languages like arguing, discussing. And we should offer the students opportunities to transfer their knowledge and skills. We've read previously about letting the students be the expert, so it can kind of boost their confidence if they're able to demonstrate their knowledge and skills. And it's good if the speaking activities have many potential answers. Again, the questions should be more complex than just yes/no questions. And we should provide the students with choice and ownership, which will give them motivation. All right, so here are some examples. You could do a book talk, which the key use of academic language that it uses is recounting. You can have students debate current issues, which uses the arguing academic language. And then another one that I like are two-way tasks that involve maps or missing information, which gets the students to discuss. And these include information gap activities. So I wanted to talk a little bit about those. One activity is draw this. So student 1 will have a picture and they describe the picture to student 2. And then student 2 will draw the picture and then they will ask questions that kind of clarify. So with this example, student 1 could say, there's a chair on the right side of the room, a toy car on the floor, and a teddy bear on the floor. And then student 2 will draw it, and at the end they can check. You can also do maps where there's information gaps and you're asking how to get somewhere or where someplace is, so they can practice giving directions. And then you can do charts where there's information that is missing and they have to ask and answer questions to fill it in. And then they can compare at the end. Someone made a comment on the reading, like that there's sometimes an issue where students will just show each other the charts just to get it done and get it done correctly without really practicing speaking. So I saw in some videos of these activities, they had students back to back. That way they couldn't see the other person's papers. That's one way to do it. Again, just set clear expectations. Maybe say you're not being graded on whether the chart is filled in correctly, but you'll be, given a participation grade about whether you're asking questions and using the right syntax and pronunciation and vocabulary. Right. So here are some sample questions that give rise to academic conversations. And again, these questions ask the students to go a little deeper than just a simple one-word answer. So they kind of are prodding questions. So yeah, you can read those on your own. So some other activities include task analyses. You can ask students to describe a task, and these can be related to social language, like they can say how to tie a shoelace, or it can be related to academic language, like explaining the process of mitosis. You can also have think aloud activities, and you can give students little prompts like I see, or from what I read, I can predict that. And these can just kind of guide them along in thinking out loud. Okay, so the purpose of assessing speaking is to show the students' progress. And this is similar to other types of assessment that we've looked at. You can do it through observations, recordings, like video or audio recordings. You can do it with checklists or rating scales. But again, we should tell the students the criteria beforehand so they know what we're looking for. And we should model oral language. So there are ways that you can integrate modalities. Like you can do a book talk. So you're integrating reading and speaking. You can do debates, demonstrations, dialogues, presentations, and dramatizations. Over here is a dramatization of the process of photosynthesis. So they are basically recounting a reading that they did, and so they include like the sun and the plants and sugar. So it's a way for them to demonstrate their comprehension, and it's integrating speaking and their reading and also dramatization. So the pace of acquiring literacy is affected by one's oral language proficiency in English. So obviously, if you have higher oral language proficiency, you're more likely to have a higher level of literacy. And also it's affected by their literacy background in the home language. So again, it's important that we know our students' academic backgrounds. And also it's affected by the exposure to explicit literacy instruction. As we all know, babies can pick up on speaking implicitly, but literacy tends to be more explicit. You have to learn how to decode symbols and how to know what sounds they make and then what words they make. So yeah, it depends on how much exposure they've had to explicit literacy instruction. And so as teachers, we need to bridge the form a bridge between oral language and literacy. So with reading, we need to consider individual differences and linguistic differences. I think this means like if the student is literate in their home language, what are the differences in the symbols or maybe the direction that they're reading, or whether it's like a highly phonemic orthography or not, and then also sociocultural differences. Maybe some people in their culture, you know, women are not supposed to read, they're supposed to just stay home. So that might affect their motivation to read if they've been told like you're, you know, not smart enough to read because you're a woman or something like that. Also, the literacy in the home language affects the literacy development in others, which we've already talked about. Obviously, if you're literate in your home language, it kind of gives you a leg up because you already know there's the process of decoding and stuff like that. Right, so to encourage reading, we can have students visualize stories in their minds, and we can identify how text is constructed around a key use of academic language, which again, those are recounting, arguing, discussing, and explaining. And we should have students become familiar with and analyze informational and narrative text, and they should understand the language of comparison, persuasion, cause, and effect. So I guess after reading something, you can say like, oh, was this comparing things, persuading, or talking about cause and effect? So for digital literacy, students nowadays, we all need to be literate with technology and, you know, computer interfaces. So students need to be able to interpret instructions from graphical displays in little pop-up boxes like this. And they need to be able to construct knowledge from nonlinear hypertextual contexts. So when you go onto Wikipedia, you can click on all these hyperlinks and then just jump from page to page to page. And we need to find a way to organize that knowledge because it's very nonlinear versus a book, you know, you read from left to right, top to bottom, and then you flip the page. So it's just very different. So students need to be aware of that. Also, they need to know how to process, manipulate, and analyze information on the screens, how to evaluate the quality and validity of information. This is very important nowadays. They need to know what sources are good. They need to understand etiquette and how to be a good, respectful person on the web. And they need to understand the different forms such as texting, emailing, and social networking. Right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about standardized exams. Specifically in Missouri in 2015, the MAP tests, I believe it's Missouri Assessment Program, which are taken by third graders through eighth graders. And they include things like ELA, math, and then science for fifth through eighth grade. So these tests used to be paper and pencil, at least when I took them, and probably when you all took them, it was on a Scantron and you filled in the bubbles and you probably got some lemon drops, which I kind of look forward to. But anyway, back in 2015, they switched these to being online on the computer. And not every school has a 1-to-1 ratio of computer to student. So it was kind of difficult for some schools, and so they extended the period of time to try to get everyone some time, in a computer lab. But again, it just had some challenges, and also it's not always equitable because some students might be doing it on a laptop with a trackpad versus other people have a mouse. So yeah, this is the modern age, and so our students, they need to have digital literacy and need to be familiar with how to take tests online and click on the little bubbles and such. Yeah, and the older students, for a long time, we've had our end of course exams on the computer, so we're pretty used to that. But for third graders, it's their first time, so they kind of need some practice beforehand. All right, so the book talks about multiliteracies, which combine two or more forms of meaningful expression. So it goes beyond the text, and includes things like visual and audio and spatial input. And these are often used for personal expression in a global and multicultural context. And we can also communicate through tactile and gestural means, so like Braille and then ASL. In things like social media, where you can have images and comments, or even movies and TV shows like The Office with captions, those combine different forms of text. So multiliteracies are creative, comprehensive, and sensitive to the characteristics of the users. And we can do project-based learning, where students are able to demonstrate their strengths and perspective, and they have a choice in design and execution, and they're able to work collaboratively and form digital portfolios, which we can, save for a long time without taking up space, and it can show students' progress over time. So when we are doing reading, we can start with shared reading, such as reading big books, which we read, in early elementary school, and charts and word and phrase walls. And then we can move on to shared to guided reading. So first, the teacher provides support, and they can look at the pictures and predict what's going to happen, track the print and echo read, where the teacher reads and then the student repeats what the teacher reads. And then they can do guided reading, where the students read independently in groups, and the teacher's kind of there to assist if needed. And the teacher also asks probing questions to guide their comprehension. So again, for documenting, we can do observations, anecdotes, checklists, look for the use of academic language and use it, and then also track their performance over time. So to assess reading comprehension, we can have students categorize words into groups. So for example, if students were reading about ecosystems and the various components, they could categorize it into living and non-living things, like plants and animals would be living, non-living things would be like water or rocks and minerals. Students can also illustrate summaries or underline the main ideas. They can do cloze exercises where they might have a word bank and then they fill in the blanks. And these always remind me of Mad Libs for some reason. They could also order pictures and sentences sequentially. They can respond to oral questions, match claims with textual evidence, identify a comparative language, like something is greater than another thing, and they can highlight hypotheses and their findings. So writing, it is done to construct meaning, and it's an interactive process between the writer, other writers and readers, and written or oral texts. So in general, a genre is a written text with similar linguistic criteria, which serves a distinct linguistic purpose. And this would be things like mysteries, blogs, recipes, and editorials. And then a text type is a group of texts with similar linguistic forms, regardless of the genre. And this could include things like stories, dramas, poetries, and biographies and technical texts. But the book likes to describe genres as communicative based across all disciplines, and text types are more for content-based learning. All right, so for documentary and genre writing, First, there needs to be developing knowledge of the content topic, and then modeling of the genre. So if we're having students write a letter, we should model it, and they should see that you start with your salutation, and then there's your body, and then you say sincerely and sign your name, stuff like that. Um, Also, we should engage in teacher-learner co-construction and forge independent writing, where the students get to pick their genre and their topic. All right, so here's some examples of genres, like an autobiography, and then it talks about the key use of academic language that it targets, which would be recounting in the case of autobiographies. So yeah, there's various examples. So when we're assessing, we need to keep in mind the student's language level of language proficiency. At the beginning, they can just draw or label objects, or write lists, or a short response to an email, and then they can move on to narrating personal stories, writing opinion blogs, or defending a position, and then later they can write critiques, reports, and research papers, which obviously require a lot more background knowledge and research. So they can keep portfolios, which will document their progress, and we should encourage both social and academic writing, and the social writing will provide insight into the students' backgrounds. And we should provide a scoring guide for long-term assignments, and this scoring guide should be clear. So now I'm going to talk about cross-linguistic transfer. So translanguaging is when you have, it provides phonological and syntactic awareness, and also the knowledge of genres can transfer. So if you know how to write a letter in English, and then you see a letter in Spanish and it says querida Laura, you could kind of assume that querida means dear because you know the genre. You can kind of anticipate what structures it's going to have. Cross-linguistic transfer also builds metalinguistic awareness, and you can use the two languages as resources. So it kind of helps you develop metacognition. And also, we should make sure in our classrooms to give all languages equal status and treatment. So here's a video I found discussing translanguaging.
Hi, my name is Ophelia Garcia. I'm a professor of urban education here at the Graduate Center. And today I've been asked to discuss translanguaging. And I've been asked to discuss what it is and who can do it. So let's start with the first question. What is translanguaging? So translanguaging is the use of the children's full linguistic repertoire to make meaning without thinking of the fact that they have one language that is different from the other. So bilingual children have one language system with linguistic features that, of course, are associated with one language or the other, but they also learn to suppress certain features depending on the communicative situation in which they're at. Translanguaging is also a way of teaching, a pedagogy that builds on that, on those fluid language practices that bilingual children have, a pedagogy that allows children, for example, to read in one language and then discuss in another, or to read in one language and write in another. So a way of using all the linguistic resources in order to make meaning. Hi, my name is
All right, so let's talk about translanguaging as a pedagogy, as a way of teaching. As the video mentioned, students have learned to suppress features of their linguistic repertoire depending on the situation. So they know if they're talking to me and I only know English, that they should speak in English, for example. While we are teaching, we should make sure to affirm the students' diverse language practices. And as a way of teaching, the video mentions how we can read in one language and then for the elicitation mode, and then for the response mode, we can have students write or discuss in another language. I think this is especially beneficial if students, if their receptive language of English, if their receptive language is strong, they could read in English, and then if their production is not there yet, they could show their comprehension by writing or discussing in their home language. So enabling them to use all of their linguistic repertoire can deepen comprehension of content. And I read an article by Ophelia Garcia, and she talks about the students' linguistic repertoire being a horizontal continua. So the languages are on the same plane, and the more languages they know, like the broader their horizons are. I think this is a beneficial perspective because sometimes languages are thought of as having a hierarchical relationship where English is the dominant language and their home language is somehow lesser. So we need to just emphasize and affirm our students diverse language practices and emphasize that the more languages they have, the better, because they have a broader horizon and all the languages are of equal worth. So I wanted to find some people's arguments against translanguaging. So I found a master's thesis, and it talks about teachers' attitudes towards translanguaging in English language classrooms in Iowa. So some of the teachers thought that translanguaging would lead to more use of the home language, um, which I guess it could. But honestly, if that's helping, going back to the previous slide, if that's deepening their comprehension of content, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And also, if it improves their metacognition and their awareness of language, then that's not a bad thing either. The teachers also worried that translanguaging would encourage off-task behavior. I guess the students could be in a corner talking in their home language, but they also could be doing that in English. So we just need to set clear expectations for classroom behavior. I think that would help with that issue. Also, using their home language, it might help them clarify a concept and improve their understanding. So it could be beneficial. And the teachers also worried that translanguaging would hinder students from thinking in English. But honestly, does it matter what language they're thinking in? They could be thinking in anything. What we're really caring about, what we're assessing, is not their thinking, but we're assessing their production or their comprehension, their reception of English. So if they want to think in their home language and then translate it to English when they're producing, I suppose that's okay. And again, having that metacognition is good, and their home language is an additional resource. All right, so here are my questions. Will you incorporate translanguaging in your future classroom? If yes, what methods will you use to incorporate it? And if not, why not? So for me personally, I would like to incorporate translanguaging in my future classroom. This is obviously going to be difficult for students that have a different home language than Spanish, because that's the one that I have learned. But I would like to let them use it if it would be beneficial. I like the idea the video mentioned of having them read or listen in one language and then respond either orally or in writing in another language. So I think that's one way I like to use it. Also, if they had peers that spoke their same home language, I would probably allow them to ask questions in their home language for clarification. But again, I'd want to set clear expectations to kind of keep the distractions at a minimum. So another question is kind of hypothetical, and it says, suppose a student's parent believes that learning English is imperative to academic and economic success in the United States. They think that using the home language at school is detrimental to their child's acquisition of English. What will you say to this parent? Will you concede to the parent and prohibit their child from translanguaging at school? So first of all, I would start off by saying that I respect the parents' idea, but I would show them some of the research or just tell them that translanguaging does have its benefits, and the home language is a resource that can help the students learn English and actually give them higher achievement levels. I would hope that the parent would agree with me and allow their child to translanguage at school. And if they did not, then I would have to think about it because I wouldn't want to disrespect the parent. But also, I don't know, you can't always keep every parent happy. So I would probably talk to a more experienced colleague about how to deal with balancing the parent's wishes and what I think is best for the student. All right, so that is the end of my presentation. I look forward to seeing your all's responses. Thanks for listening. Let's see.